This video is going to give a rundown of the setting of the Old Clay, some basic geography and important locations, the current state of the setting, a look at the levels of technology, how the elements and substances work in this world, and later on a little bit about what it's like to be a normal person in this world. If you're new here, the Old Clay is a dark fantasy world-building project about dogmatic alchemists who use salt, sulfur, and mercury to forever alter themselves in the pursuit of perfection. It's a dark fantasy story that incorporates a lot of body horror, cosmic horror, and late-stage capitalism horror. If you want to learn more about the magic system I made for this setting, Lawful Alchemy, check out this video linked at the top of the screen. The Second Mander Empire exists in Gretton, an enormous continental landmass that at one point contained dozens of different biomes and hundreds of different cultures. That is until the Empire came in and colonized almost everything, and scraped the land clean of natural resources. There are a lot of lands outside of Gretton, but that's a little outside the scope of this video, so we'll have to explore the other lands of this world another day. For now, let's stick to Gretton. And since I don't want to overwhelm everyone with a barrage of proper nouns, let's just focus on two main points of interest for now: the great capital city of Mander, and the great stone city of Vrot. Mander is located here, in the western half of the Empire. It sits on a major road that connects the western coast to the eastern coast. Mander is the heart of the Empire and the home of the Court of Lawful Alchemy. It contains the Golden Armory, an enormous workshop and factory that produces the Empire's alchemical weaponry, far more advanced than anything fielded by any other power. The city itself is a behemoth, orders of magnitude larger than the next largest city in Gretton. It's home to millions, including the Empress Grinsic Mander. She resides in the Royal Palace, which sits in the shadows of the enormous three-sided ziggurat that is the Court of Lawful Alchemy. Laws, philosophy, economy, and truth all are created here and disseminated throughout the Heartland and the colonies. Vrot is located here, in the Dermont, a large mountain range that cuts across the northern edge of the Empire. Vrot is built directly into the mountainside of the Dermont. It's a relatively small city in terms of area, but it's very densely populated. The entire area is subarctic, which means long, bitter winters and short, meager summers. Vrot was originally a city controlled by Odova, a kingdom that once held a significant portion of the Dermont. It is now controlled by the Empire, and has been for about 200 years. Over the past century or so, there have been a number of violent revolts in Vrot as local Odov resistance groups attempt to take the city back from the Empire. The city has fallen and been reclaimed a handful of times by each faction, and at this point, the Empire has redoubled its efforts to keep Vrot, as it is the strategic key to controlling the eastern half of the Empire. And aside from the great capital city of Mander itself, Vrot is the largest population center in the Empire. Right now, the Empire holds a tenuous grasp as another full-blown revolution is brewing. The city experiences frequent food shortages as disrupted supply lines to the south make it very difficult to supplement the region's subpar agriculture and the city's ever-growing refugee population. The landscape of Gretton has been scoured and scraped clean in a desperate attempt to meet the ever-increasing demands for salt, sulfur, and mercury. Once thriving ecosystems have been turned to barren fields of gray dust. Grand mountains have been hollowed out into shells in search of raw material, and countless plagues and abominations ravage the people of Gretton as a result of failed alchemical experimentation. Failures lead to more failures as alchemists of the court try to cover their past mistakes with ever more risky and ever less tested solutions, often causing more problems than they solve, though the Court of Lawful Alchemy would never admit even the smallest degree of fault. Some time ago, feeling the ever-mounting oppression of the Empire, the borderlands began to revolt, one by one. First it was Cord, then Mordania, then the coasts along Grey Edge to the east. And now there are even whispers that the ancient Odov have begun to stir deep within their tombs in the Dermont. The rebel factions have begun to recruit traitorous alchemists of the court, who teach them the secrets of lawful alchemy. And now, with Vrot facing a full-scale rebellion, the fate of the Empire sits on the edge of a knife. If they lose Vrot, they lose the Dermont, and they lose control of the eastern half of the continent. As the Eternal Empire of Three Shapes faces its eventual demise, the powers therein plot against one another in a desperate attempt to secure the best possible outcome for themselves once the dust settles. The Empire is desperately trying to keep their tenuous control of their territories, while also contending with resource shortages, political turmoil, civil unrest, and internal power struggles. The level of technology in this world is hard to quantify in relation to real-world centuries, as some areas of study are more similar to 11th to 12th century, some more 16th, 17th, some early industrial, and some are even beyond what we have now. But I think a good baseline to start off with is a dark fantasy setting with roughly 15th to 16th century technology, which would put it mid to late Renaissance. In my Discord, the Mercurialist faction chat was discussing levels of tech, and it was mentioned that the evolution of technology is the result of societal need. Since the Mander Empire has different needs than we do in the real world due to the prevalence of lawful alchemy, it's safe to assume that technology doesn't evolve in the same way that it does in the real world. For instance, since Selenites can alter human physiology and conduct semi-advanced metallurgy, there is less of a pressure to develop mechanized fabrication techniques. Not to say that there is no need, just less of a need. If a Mercurialist can store and catalog vast amounts of information themselves, and do advanced mathematical calculations on the fly, there is less of a need to further develop computing technology. There is no mechanical flight, no stabilized electricity, and no robotics. There is no large-scale industrialization, but the Empire is moving that direction. Efficient resource allocation and goods production is a primary concern right now, considering the ramping shortages of the primes. That being said, industrialization may look different in the old clay, considering their alchemical power, but we'll see when we get there. Enough about what there isn't, let's talk about what there is. As you may have seen in the concept art in some of my previous videos, there is early firearm technology, as well as some alternative combustion technology used by sulfurists. The vwuhtankschkboref, for instance, can use their breath to ignite and propel volatile compounds. The setting still uses plate armor, blades, and bows. I know that there is a common perception of history where there's a very clear-cut line between the use of plate armor and the use of firearms. Like, as soon as firearms were invented, militaries just completely ditched armor and swords and took up line formations. But in reality, there was actually a several hundred-year overlap in which firearms and plate armor were effectively used at the exact same time. And it's the same way in the old clay. That being said, lawful alchemy does provide many benefits, one of which is the creation and enhancement of materials with increased durability, flexibility, hardness, or additional properties. The Golden Armory creates alchemically enhanced versions of weaponry, like the Gustad, a crossbow-like artillery piece which uses specialized altered metals to magnetically propel a variety of explosive and armor-piercing projectiles over long distances. These are the weaponry primarily used by the Mukenstad. They are so large and so cumbersome that they require two specially constructed selenite hulks in order to carry and reload. They are also so expensive and so difficult to produce that there have only been 11 functional versions ever made. Their mechanisms are so complex and violent that they're prone to breaking, requiring constant repairs. Of the 11 that have been made, 5 or 6 are in the Golden Armory being repaired at any given time, and 2 have been captured by rebel factions. The Golden Armory is located in the great capital city of Mander and is the forefront of military technology. Also located in Mander is the eastern branch of the Stone Garden, a Selenite faction whose primary goal is the creation and manipulation of life. They create skeletons out of hollow metal bone and animate them using a combination of scavenged and synthetically grown flesh. They create all sorts of life, from beasts of burden, to hulking war brutes, to even the famed Korenstad. There are also the horrifying flesh beasts, creatures that were not manually constructed, but grown organically from alchemically altered embryos and flesh sculpted into their desired forms. These were originally the experiments of the apothecaries of Parth, but now the court is trying to reverse engineer their work for their own means. And finally, last little fun fact about technology is that the Mercurialists actually have a form of the internet. It's called the tessellation stream. It's an interconnected network of synaptic radiance that allows them to send and communicate information over long distances. More on this in the future. As many of you have observed, the existence of lawful alchemy implies the existence of unlawful alchemy. And this is true. There are plenty of unlawful factions of alchemists. These can be former members or factions of the court that were expelled for going outside of the allowed practices. These can be former members or factions of the court that defected for ideological reasons. Or these can be individuals or factions that attempt to learn alchemy on their own without the permission of the court. There is a lot of unlawful alchemy going on, and I will definitely be digging deeper into it in the future. The unlawful faction that I've probably talked the most about is the Coven of Astral Clairvoyance, a group of mercurialists who transfuse highly saturated blood in order to form a pseudo-hive mind. There's also the Apothecaries of Parth, whom I mentioned earlier, whose many experiences with flesh sculpting had them expelled from the court, but not before the court stole all of their research. Now, we've talked so much about alchemists and alchemy and the people who are saturated, but what about the unsaturated? What about just the common folk of the Empire? Despite all of this talk about saturation and lawful alchemy, the majority of the Empire is actually unsaturated. Just normal people trying to live their lives. In densely populated areas, I'd put the ratio of alchemists to non-alchemists at about 1 to 100. In more rural areas, it can be closer to 1 to 1,000. The saturated are much more common in populous areas. Most Grets were sent to the various war fronts when the rebellions broke out, either as soldiers or as labor workers. Those left behind are mostly the unwanted, unfit, or infirmed. The days in the Central Territories are quiet now. Towns are underpopulated, with some left fully abandoned as the remaining residents go elsewhere for food or work. Many of the unsaturated left behind in the central regions are employed in some aspect of the prime trade: mining, harvesting, refining, shipping, etc. There's also a thriving alchemical black market, where primes are smuggled and sold to unlawful organizations. Currently in the setting, the court is facing major shortages of all three primes, forcing them to get creative with new ways to recycle used prime, new ways to create synthetic primes, and new ways to saturate with other substances. Speaking of which, I wanted to talk briefly about how substances and elements work in the old clay, since I've had a lot of questions about it. This isn't necessarily crucial to understanding the setting, it's kind of more deep lore stuff, but I do think it's somewhat important. In this setting, they don't use the chemical elements on the periodic table like we do on Earth. Not just that they use a different chart or something, the actual elements themselves work differently on an atomic level. In the old clay, all elements exist in a sort of family tree, with salt, sulfur, and mercury at the top, and all other elements descending from one of them. This is the hierarchy of substances. The Court of Lawful Alchemy also calls this the Turnian fractal. Each prime can be split into perfect thirds through a process called terceration. 3 sub-elements of the parent, each embodying an aspect of its parent. Each of those 3 can then be divided into 3 more sub-elements, and each of those can be divided into 3 more sub-elements, and so on, theoretically forever. So every element in the world is a descendant of either salt, sulfur, or mercury, and composes a small aspect of them. Saturation with other elements is technically possible, but the further down in the hierarchy you go, saturation becomes exponentially less effective. There are some factions who are attempting to find ways to saturate with sub-elements, like an order of sulfurists who are using gas compression chambers and artificial respiratory systems to attempt to saturate with phosphorus, which descends directly from sulfur. Elements can be broken down into their perfect thirds, but perfect thirds cannot be recombined into their parent, meaning when a prime is tercerated, it's gone forever. But considering the severe shortages, the court is experimenting with ways to synthesize primes from other elements. Nothing has been successful yet. All that being said, compounds like minerals do exist. One that I've seen discussed a lot, especially on my Discord, is cinnabar, an abundant mineral made of mercury and sulfur. Cinnabar exists, it's just sulfur and mercury mixed. It's not its own bespoke element. Salt isn't sodium chloride, it's just salt. Sodium exists, but it descends from salt. Hopefully that makes some degree of sense. I know it's all really nitty-gritty, I understand. Again, this is not at all necessary to understand the world, it's just that some people are very interested in the mechanics of all of this, as am I obviously, so I thought I'd share. I can go into more detail on the hierarchy of substances and the Turnian fractal if people want, but the exact placement of substances is still largely a work in progress. Finally, I wanted to quickly touch on something I've seen discussed a fair bit in the comments and in my Discord. The three primes aren't necessarily meant to be perfectly balanced against one another. Not in the sense that you might expect from a video game or something. They're all important parts of a whole. They each serve an important function, but certain functions might be valued more or less by specific groups of people or specific institutes. I didn't design this magic system so that each prime would be exactly the same and exactly as powerful and exactly as useful and have the exact same number of drawbacks and benefits as the next. I designed it specifically so they would all be different. If it seems kind of unfair that Mercurialists get all these great benefits with very few drawbacks, and their main drawback is actually more of a danger to others than themselves, well, that's because it is unfair. It's kind of supposed to be. As I said in my Sulfur video, it's really easy to quantify how strong a Selenite is or how smart a Mercurialist is, but it's harder to quantify spiritual enlightenment. It's harder to put a value on that, and all of that is sort of by design. I don't really think it's a coincidence that most people's favorite faction is the Mercurialists. It's the Mander Empire's favorite faction too. Thank you all very much for watching. Honestly, I've been struggling a little bit with how to best meter out information. I want to give people enough to really chew on without just revealing everything and killing the sense of mystery. So I thought this video might provide a good foundation of setting knowledge moving forward. Hopefully I'm finding a decent balance. If you like these videos, consider subscribing. There is a lot more Old Clay stuff to come. There will be no shortage of cool content from here on out. Thank you to everyone who submitted artwork to be featured in this week's ending slideshow. If you want to submit your artwork, email it to oliver@theoldclay.com with the subject line art submission. You can submit visual art, music, poetry, whatever else you can think of, and I'll showcase it here. As always, a special thank you to my Patreon supporters. You can join my Patreon for free and get full lore breakdowns of each of my drawings, updates, and what have you. Higher tiers get you work-in-progress updates on my art, exclusive wallpapers, monthly Q&As, random lore drops, and a bunch more. Thank you to my Alchemist tier patrons, Aurora Sky, Slick Sick, Viridian Seas, Butterscotch 08, Josh Hall, John Pork, Kirshma Patel, Ethan Nolmeyer, Great Gowan, Jack McDonald, The Salinist, Asmieth, and Zelades. And a special thank you to the judges of the court, Salamnius, Artorius, Hayden Lee Tubbs, Reaching Beyond, and my parents. Thanks, guys.